Jesus Never Existed by Kenneth Humphreys. Audiobook version. Chapter 4. Just Who Were the Jews? Chapter 4. Prologue. Abram, or Ibrahim, is an amazingly righteous phantom with a lot to answer for. Father of, quote, many nations, his primordial behavior set a terrifying example. Not only the attempted murder of his favorite son, but abandoning to the desert the offspring of his various concubines. Sadly, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all pay homage to this con man and warlord. Quote, lived to the ripe old age of 175, unquote, would you believe? Genesis 25:7. But in reality, never actually existed. Of course, that hardly matters to religious zealots. Genesis. First invent your Jew, then invent your Christ. In the 7th century BC, a gaggle of emigre priests hiding in the mountains of Judea concocted, quote, Judaism and a mythical history of racial origins. A marginal band of Semites reinvented themselves. Out of Egypt? Palpable nonsense. Much of Judaism is a dialogue with Egypt, that towering civilization which overshadowed the whole of the Levant. But the ancient Egyptians knew nothing of, quote, the Jews. Imperial Israel? Boy wonder and the emperor with no clothes. What kingdom? Strange that no one but the Jews noticed when a shepherd giant killer, court musician poet, turned warlord and conquered a Middle Eastern empire. Could it all be a lie? What empire? The fabled king with, quote-unquote, 1,000 wives and concubines left not one brick of evidence. On the margins of real empire, Assyria and Babylon. Unlike biblical Israel, Assur really existed, and its reality influenced the Jewish fable. Quote-unquote Jewish religion, as elaborated by its priests and scribes, was imposed by the force and authority of the Persian Empire. Chapter 4, first section. Genesis. First invent your Jew, then invent your Christ. The myth of the Jewish, quote-unquote, race. To understand the rise of Christianity, one must come to terms with the people who were its original authors, the Jews. The Jews claim themselves to be a race, a people or a nation. But are they? The earliest reference yet found to this singular people is on a statue from the Syrian city of Alalak, dated to about 1550 BC. The inscription refers to Hapiru warriors in the land of Kin-Anu, a presence confirmed by clay tablets from Akhenaten's capital of Amarna, referring to marauders in the hill country of Palestine. The famous stele of Pharaoh Merneptah, dated to 1207 BC, records, quote, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not, unquote. Israel here is a reference to a people, not a territory. The weight of evidence suggests these original, quote, Hebrews coalesced during the Bronze Age from successive migrations, some from the periphery of the Nile Delta, in Egyptian Peru or Apiru meant a laborer, but most from across the Jordan and Euphrates rivers. In their own Semitic tongue, Habiru meant beyond, suggesting an origin elsewhere. In Babylonian script, Kabiru referred to a class of slaves. As a people, therefore, Hebrews combined Mesopotamian and Egyptian stock, almost certainly drawn from the lowest social order, conceivably including runaway slaves. One migration, at least, brought with it a mountain/sky god, Yahweh, destined for higher things. Settlement in Canaan. As barbarous newcomers to what was the land of Canaan, these Semites, speakers of a tongue common to Syrians, Arabs, and Mesopotamians, took up migratory occupation of the less fertile hill country of the interior. Neither their limited subculture and illiterate donkey nomadism, nor their social organization, patriarchal and authoritarian, distinguish them from other tent-dwelling pastoralists. These early polytheistic Hebrews scratched an existence from an unpromising land on the fringes of the major civilizations, occasionally moving with their animals into the Nile Delta in times of drought. It seems as if they were joined over time by outcasts or refugees from the more sophisticated Canaanite, i.e. Phoenician, coastal cities. Quote, Israel emerged peacefully and gradually from within Canaanite society, end quote, concluded Karen Armstrong, the noted religious scholar. A History of Jerusalem, page 23. The Canaanite migrants brought with them cultic practices and images of their traditional gods. A major Canaanite god was El, and the phrase, quote, El has conquered, unquote, gives us the word Israel. The Canaanite god El had a ghostly presence in a host of Jewish heroes, Dan-e-El, Ezekiel, Samuel, Ishmael, Elijah, Elohim, etc. God-inspired names were common throughout the West Semitic language region. Other Canaanite gods included Baal, a storm god, also honored in a host of Hebrew names, like Jerubbaal, Asherah, a fertility goddess, consort of El, Shalem, a Syrian sun god, later to be honored in the name Jerusalem, Milcom, Chamash, etc. Ru-Shalimim is mentioned in records in the pharaoh Sesostris III, 1872 to 1847 BC. The settlement actually pre-existent long before the tribe of Hebrews made it their own. The site then appears to have been unoccupied for 300 years, until the Jebusites, otherwise known as Kereti or Peliti, i.e. Cretans or Philistines, arrived. Blood sacrifice. Influenced by these Canaanite cults, but devoid of artistic or metalworking skills of their own, the early Hebrews adopted a way of honoring their god of choice by genital mutilation. This sometime practice of the Egyptian priesthood became, for the, quote, Jews, a tribal obligation, part of the male regenerative organ offered as a blood sacrifice to the, quote, jealous god Yahweh. Other gods were worshipped, but Yahweh demanded precedence. Thus, though the Hebrews were not a race, the males at least acquired a distinctiveness from other Semitic tribesmen who did not practice circumcision. Women, regarded as mere chattels, were spared this mutilation. In this period of Proto-Judaism, polygamous males acted as, quote, priests for their extended families and kinship groups and exercised absolute authority over wives and children. At some point in the 10th century BC, the Hebrews were completely overwhelmed by the more advanced Philistines moving down from the north. Armed with iron weapons and deploying chariots, the Philistines scattered the primitive Hebrew nomads into the hill country and a few austere places in the Jordan River Valley. The various Hebrew clans had no single warlord, but were led by tribal elders and shamans. The backward Hebrews remained under the sway of their shamanic, quote, judges to a much later date than neighboring peoples. Theirs was a harsh culture of, quote, scapegoat sacrifice and collective and inherited guilt, eye for an eye, vengeance. As marginalized pastoralists, they were acutely xenophobic and demonized the city dwellers and farmers. Sacred history. With the ebb and flow of empires over centuries and the endless movement of peoples, we might have expected this marginal tribe to have passed into history along with countless other peoples, assimilated into a greater multitude. But we have a story, a tale of tribal fidelity with frequent and instructive lapses to a protector god, Yahweh, who had chosen his, quote, people as his very own. For them, he had a divine purpose. In particular, their migration into Canaan is given an heroic reinterpretation. No longer do we have piecemeal migration over centuries, but a single glorious conquest by a cohesive people. The, quote, idolatrous city dwellers of, quote, Jericho, etc., get their comeuppance, and the whole land is promised to the Jews in perpetuity. They have, it would seem, arrived as a single group from Egypt, released from slavery by divine intervention. The extraordinary thing about this, quote, history, complete with verbatim dialogue between man and God, is that it was not written until more than 1,000 years after the supposed events. Records one historian, quote, the first millennium of Jewish history as presented in the Bible has no empirical foundation whatsoever, end quote. Cantor, The Sacred Chain, page 51. Scant evidence, the quote-unquote Lachish letters. Startling as it may seem, the only first-hand, quote, evidence we have for the entire corpus of the Old Testament, with its numerous tales of tribulation and triumph, are a few bits of crockery. Found in the ruins of Tel Ed-Duir in the 1930s, the fragments bear a few words of Hebrew relating to the fall of Judean cities to the Babylonians in the 580s BC. The letters are from outposts of Lachish to the city's military commander, a man named Yaosh, and represent field reports monitoring the situation as the armies of Nebuchadnezzar closed in. Some writers find confirmation of the biblical, quote, Jeremiah in these scraps, letter 16 to be precise, though the reference could equally well have been to a Urijah. The issue scarcely matters, for the monumental dearth of material points to a bigger truth. The impressive race history, tracing the Jews, the people of Judah, back through Hebrews in Canaan and Israelites in Egypt to a noble ancestor called Abraham, father, it seems, of all the races, including Greeks and Arabs, and the whole melodramatic story of the Exodus was concocted at a much later date, after the tribal leadership of these Judean tribesmen had been taken into exile and had learned the rudiments of civilization from their Babylonian captors. This was not at the dawn of time, but in the 7th century BC, when Greece was already a civilization and Carthage had a maritime empire. The original Hebrew/Canaanite occupants of Palestine did pass into history. Many, including the so-called quote-unquote lost tribes of Israel, those living in northern Palestine, were assimilated by Assyrian conquerors during the 8th century BC. But the quote victors, a Persian-sponsored priesthood who settled in Judea in the 6th century BC, wrote a sacred history known to the Jews as the Torah, or Pentateuch, and to the Christians as the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Together with the quotes each, prophets, and wisdom literature, this voluminous text purports to be an account of the trials and vexations of the Jews through the previous 2 millennia. Rather oddly, its detail and obvious accuracy peters out the closer it approaches the time when it was actually written. Joshua, supposedly on the rampage in the 13th century BC, gets vast reportage, whereas several 7th century kings known to history are omitted. Indeed, the 400 years between the last book of the Old Testament, the 5th century Malachi, and the first book of the New Testament echo in a biblical silence. No biblical text gives the conquest of Palestine by Alexander the Great in 323 BC a mention. Ptolemaic Egypt's loss of her Palestinian provinces to Syria in 198 BC is unrecorded. Personages like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great are overlooked. And the books of Maccabees, which should tell us the, quote, recent story of the successful Jewish rebellion against Greek rule in the 2nd century BC, are so filled with error and incoherence that even biblical editors shunted them into the Apocrypha or omitted them entirely. But of course, we are not speaking of history, but rather of sacred testimony, designed to control, justify, and inspire. Anyone can be factual. In the Bible, we have a book with a purpose. Second section. Out of Egypt, palpable nonsense. The 2 primary books of the Old Testament, Genesis and Exodus, refer to, quote, Pharaoh 155 times. Curiously, not once in either book is Pharaoh identified by name, and yet, in fact, the references are to many different pharaohs across many centuries. The anomaly is all the more telling in that the holy books are not lacking in naming numerous sundry and incidental characters. For example, the grandmother of King Asa of Judah was Abishalom, should you be interested. 1 Kings 15:10. But this style of literature should be familiar to us all. Quote, once upon a time, in a land far away, was a bad king, and in the forest David played... ... It's called a fairy tale. Let's remind ourselves of Israel's supposed early encounters with the diverse kings of Egypt. Egypt and the patriarchs. In the sacred history, the quote-unquote father of the races, Abraham, is placed in Babylonia, anachronistically relabeled Chaldea, a term more appropriate to the empire of Nebuchadnezzar in the 600s BC. The character of Abraham alternates between Bedouin pastoralist and landed grandee. Neither has the slightest claim to historical veracity. Abraham, an unnamed pharaoh number 1. To identify this pharaoh, choose any date between 2300 and 1400 BC. Abraham's supposed existence hinges exclusively on biblical sources and working backwards from the supposed existence of Solomon several centuries later. The good book informs us that there is a 10-year age gap between Abraham and his wife/half-sister Sarah, Genesis 17:17. Thus, when the patriarch gets God's call to leave Haran, Sarah is already a pensioner. He is 75, so she is 65. Genesis 12:1. After wandering in Canaan, a spate of altar building and camping in the mountains, famine drives the old fellow and his missus down into Egypt. Genesis 12:12. Abraham fears his wife's, quote, great beauty will get him killed, so they concoct the ruse that, quote unquote, she's my sister. Sure enough, Sarah gets fast-tracked into the harem of Pharaoh, but the duped king gets a nasty case of the plague. Though the trick is unmasked, Abraham is allowed to leave, with Sarah and, it seems, with all his ill-gotten gains. The patriarch, his wives, his Egyptian slave, and King Abimelech. Tired of waiting for her God-promised pregnancy, she is now 75, Sarah encourages Abraham to impregnate his compliant slave Hagar, Genesis 16. The result is Ishmael, he who will father 12, quote, Arab princes. 13 years pass in the town of Hebron, during which time Abraham heads up a military force to rescue his nephew Lot, captured by 4 raiding kings. Genesis 14. The invaders are, quote, utterly routed near Damascus, and Abraham gets blessed by the mysterious priest king Melchizedek. In contrast, when Abraham takes a, quote, sojourn in Gerar, the remarkable warrior/sage again fears Sarah's, quote, great beauty will get him killed. For a second time they employ the, quote, she's my sister ruse. King Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem, and Abraham collects another bounty. Genesis 20:1 through 18. Luckily, the Philistine king gets a private message from God and sends the happy couple on their way. The 90-year-old Sarah now gives birth to Isaac, gets Hagar and Ishmael thrown out of the tent, and lives to the ripe old age of 127. Genesis 23:2. Abraham, 137 at the time of Sarah's death, is still in the prime of life and takes Keturah as his new wife. She produces for him not 1 but 6 more children. The old goat does not himself check out until he is 175 years old. Isaac doesn't get to meet a pharaoh. Perhaps the trauma of ritual abuse when he was a boy made him a bit of a stay-at-home. His dad sends a servant out to get him a wife, and when Isaac gets to the quote-unquote famine strikes Canaan bit, his fidelity to Yahweh causes him not to go down into Egypt, the exact opposite of his dad's behavior. Believe it or not, Isaac and his wife Rebekah use the same she's my sister trick on the hapless king Abimelech in Genesis 26:1 through 14. Jacob, trickster son of Isaac, is the guy who fathers the ancestors of all 12 tribes. Amazingly, he gets to wrestle with God himself. Genesis 32:24. Hence his new name, quote, Israel. El has conquered. He meets a pharaoh after his favorite son Joseph has made the big time. It seems unnamed pharaoh number 2 asks Jacob his age, a sprightly 130, and he lives a further 17 years in Goshen, and receives a blessing in return. Joseph and unnamed pharaoh number 2. Sojourn. Choose any date between 1900 and 1500 BC for this pharaoh. There is no evidence that Joseph ever existed either. Abraham got to meet the great king of Egypt by having a real babe as his wife. Joseph, his great-grandson, got to meet Pharaoh by being a real babe himself. It seems that the wife of Potiphar, captain of the Imperial Guard, who had bought Joseph, got the hots for the young man, but he was having none of it. Thrown into prison on a false charge, Genesis 39, he made a name for himself by, quote, dream interpretation, unquote. This, it seems, is enough to get him catapulted before the god king himself. Once again, an Egyptian monarch is shown to be amazingly credulous. On the strength of a 14-year forecast of, quotes each, good and bad harvests, the inexperienced foreign pastoralist is made Grand Vizier and given command of the world's most important agricultural economy. Fat chance. But this, would you believe, is the foundation stone of the Hebrew presence in Egypt. Joseph's reorganized agronomy saves Egypt, and a grateful pharaoh sends carts to bring Joseph's clan to Egypt. Quote, all the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. End quote. Genesis 45-47. A handful of Hebrews take up residence in Egypt, multiply prodigiously, and, in the familiar story, are first enslaved, then set free. 70 persons arrive and multiply with a phenomenal rabbit-like fecundity to reach 3 million in 215 years, an average of 66 children per female. Note, 430 years is often quoted, but in the original version of the story, as reiterated in the Septuagint and by Josephus, half of that time was spent in Canaan. Egypt and, quote, Moses, fantasy on steroids. As nomads, the migratory pattern of the Hebrews might take them into the Nile Delta. Egyptian forces repeatedly passed through Palestine to fight wars further north. Any culture the Jews did not copy from the Babylonians, they took instead from the Egyptians. Tellingly, the huge corpus of Egyptian records contains no reference at all to Israelites, the oppression, the Exodus, or Moses. The Hapiru were, after all, merely bandits on the Canaanite frontier. The closest we get to, quote, Israelites in bondage, unquote, is some evidence for Canaanite cities in the Nile Delta. These almost certainly were established by that alliance of tribes known as the, quote, Sea People, that successfully invaded Egypt in the 13th and 12th century BC. In effect, the Jews, bit players in a history over many centuries, quote, talked up their own ancestral origins by associating themselves with the major empires and events around them. Probably their fanciful tale of the fall of Jericho and other Canaanite cities is a recasting of the invasion of the coastal plain from the north by the Philistines, unlike themselves, users of iron weapons. The hero of the Exodus has an Egyptian, not a Hebrew, name, as in Thutmoses, Moses, etc. No contemporary, non-biblical source mentions Moses, and the lack of any external reference in the biblical story makes it impossible to connect the life of the superhero with the known history of other cultures. In quotes, Baby Moses, and unnamed Pharaoh number 3, ethnic cleanser. Choose any date between 1500 and 1200 BC for this pharaoh. We are not told the name of the pharaoh, but the Hebrew midwives are Shiphrah and Puah. In this unlikely episode, a pharaoh who, quote, does not know, unquote, Joseph, is alarmed by the explosive growth of the Hebrews and decides, quote, hard labor will keep them in check. Exodus 1:8 through 14. Frustrated that this does not work, we are talking Hebrew virility here, he issues an order that all the newborn male infants of the Hebrews should be drowned. One is saved in an ark made of bulrushes daubed with slime. Amazingly, none other than the daughter of Pharaoh himself finds the infant mariner and adopts him as her own. But in true pantomime fashion, his own mother is hired to nurse him. The idea of, quote, threatened child becomes a great figure, unquote, is commonplace. It was told of Sargon the Great, Heracles, Romulus and Remus, etc. It is, of course, reworked in the story of Jesus. In the Moses story, we have a foretaste of the Jesus fantasy itself. According to Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, 2:9, Pharaoh's daughter is named Thermuthis, a name which she happens to share with a manifestation of Isis, which would make Moses the Horus figure. Irenaeus, but not the Christian Bible, reiterates Josephus' other startling claim, that God gave the polytheistic Egyptians counsel to make Moses generalissimo. Our youthful hero, quote, cheerfully accepted, rallied the Egyptians, and defeated the Ethiopians, who had overrun the entire country. His victory included vanquishing a, quote-unquote, multitude of serpents with the, quote, ibis bird. What a coincidence! In Egyptian mythology, the evil Seth, in the guise of a snake, had bitten the infant Horus. He had been saved by Thoth, the ibis-headed god. In true fairy tale manner, the Ethiopian princess saw Moses from the city wall, fell immediately in love, and brokered peace for marriage, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, not quite. In quotes, Prince Moses, and unnamed Pharaoh number 4, oppression. The youthful Moses becomes a murderer and fugitive from justice. Exodus 2:11 through 15. Moses flees to Arabia, where he marries the daughter of a Midianite priest and lives as a shepherd. His father-in-law is Reuel, Exodus 2:18, or Jethro, Exodus 3:1 or 4:18, or Hobab, Judges 4:11. Take your pick. After 40 years in Midian, Moses returns to Egypt to make his famous demand of Pharaoh to quote-unquote let go, Exodus 5:1, the people he has lived without for 80 years, Exodus 7:7. In quotes, Patriarch Moses, and unnamed Pharaoh number 5, Exodus. This Pharaoh is the hard-man opponent of Moses. Well, he can't help it. God himself hardened his heart, Exodus 4:21, 7:3, etc. The whole pageant would collapse if he had been a softy like Pharaohs 1 and 2. 10 plagues later, and Egypt loses its labor force and its army, Exodus 5. Moses, an octogenarian, now begins 40 years of wandering. Note salt crystals in the mummy of Merentah favored him as the drowned pharaoh of the Exodus, until it was realized all mummies showed evidence of these embalming salts. Oddly enough, Egypt reached new heights of imperial splendor and prosperity during the New Kingdom, the 18th and 19th dynasties. Thutmose III campaigned beyond the Euphrates and reached the Fourth Cataract on the Nile. Ramses II halted the advance of the Hittites in Syria and built more temples and monuments than anyone. Perhaps those Hebrews hadn't pulled their weight after all. Though the colorful story of the Hebrew exodus from Egypt is known to everyone, the legend itself is a complete fantasy, a rewrite of a story learned in Babylon. In Exodus, Yahweh creates a people, not the cosmos. Quote, instead of splitting the carcass of a sea monster to create the world as Marduk did, Yahweh divided the sea of reeds to let his people escape from Pharaoh and the pursuing army. Instead of slaying the demonic hordes like Marduk, Yahweh drowned the Egyptians. K. Armstrong, A History of Jerusalem, page 31. In the fantasy, quote, history, chapter 1 of the book of Numbers, 603,550, quote, males of military age, end quote, fled Egypt at the time of the Exodus, which implies a refugee army of at least 2 million, more than the total population of Egypt itself. And this multitude supposedly wandered the wilderness for 40 years, contriving to leave not a trace of their passing for posterity. Records one historian, quote, despite the mass of contemporary records that have been unearthed in Egypt, not one historical reference to the presence of the Israelite has yet been found there. Not a single mention of Joseph, the Pharaoh's grand vizier. Not a word about Moses or the spectacular flight from Egypt and the destruction of the pursuing Egyptian army, end quote. Magnus Magnusson, The Archaeology of the Bible Lands BC, page 43. Not that Egypt had no impact on the people who were to emerge as Jews in the 6th century BC. Jewish theology is permeated with ideas which had prevailed in Egypt for millennia. For example, that most hallowed of Jewish festivals, the Passover, was borrowed from an Egyptian celebration of the spring equinox of the passing of the sun from south to north of the equator. Passover, the most important feast of the Jewish calendar, is celebrated at the first full moon after the vernal equinox, typically occurring on March 21st, though it can fall a day earlier or later. Many scholars have seen a link between the sun-worshipping monotheism of Akhenaten and the Yahweh-worshipping monotheism of the Jews. Conceivably, expelled priests of the Aten started the whole thing off. A nomadic people required a portable god. Though they contrived to make a virtue of their technical inability to make idols, nonetheless, their sacred texts anthropomorphized the deity, a human representation of the pharaoh's son, spelled S-U-N. So humanoid was their god, that initially they provided him with a mobile home, the so-called Ark of the Covenant. This itself was originally an Egyptian idea, paraded about as a lethal protector of the tribe and throne for their god. It somewhat lost its importance when Philistines sacked the settlement of Shiloh and carried away the ark as a trophy. It was not replaced. Though nominally, quote, invisible, and now homeless, Yahweh acquired a most man-like countenance. Biblical pharaohs, unknown to Egyptians. Despite the omission of pharaonic names in Genesis, Exodus, and most other biblical books, in a few places, pharaohs are indeed named. This should have made it possible to synchronize the real history of Egypt with some part of the purported, quote, history of the Jews recorded in the Bible. Unfortunately, there is a small problem. The Bible's pharaohs are unknown in all of the vast corpus of Egyptian history. Thus, 1 Kings 11:40 introduces the character, quote, Shishak. 2 Kings 17:4 brings on, quote, So, and Jeremiah 44:30 gives us Hophrah. The anomaly has given rise to 200 years of, in quotes, name that pharaoh. With many centuries, 30-odd dynasties, and dozens of monarchs to choose from, the possibilities are endless. Jeroboam's, quote, refuge in Egypt. Pharaoh Shishak delivers God's punishment on Judah, 1000 to 800 BC. In the last days of Solomon, a laborer promoted to overseer called Jeroboam, quote unquote, lifts up his hand against the monarch and has to flee to Egypt and the protection of Shishak, who of course has an open house for renegade Jewish laborers. 1 Kings 11. Solomon dies. Jeroboam becomes king of 10 northern tribes. What a star! And Solomon's legitimate heir, Rehoboam, is left with just 2 tribes in the south. Jeroboam's accommodating monarch, Shishak, plunders the temple of Jerusalem, controlled by his rival, and conquers the whole of Judah. We never hear of Shishak again. Nothing is known in Egypt of, quote, Shishak, but inscriptions of Pharaoh Shoshenq the First, 22nd dynasty, record his attack upon Jerusalem. So Shoshenq has traditionally been identified as the biblical Shishak. Hosea of Samaria challenges the king of Assyria. Quote, Pharaoh So to the rescue, 800 to 700 BC. Quote, and the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him to prison. End quote. 2 Kings 17:4. An obvious candidate for So is Shoshenq, but he's already identified with Shishak. Thutmose III has a temple relief showing conquered cities of Judea. Perhaps we should make Thutmose Shishak so that So can be Shoshenq. Egyptian civil war written into the story. Pharaoh, quote, Hophrah, gets on the wrong side of the Lord. Quote, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I give you Pharaoh Hophrah, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies, and into the hand of them that seek his life, as I gave Zedekiah, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, his enemy, and that sought his life. End quote. Jeremiah 44:30. With the clue of Nebuchadnezzar, 605 to 561 BC, and an obvious fate, chief suspect is the grandson of Pharaoh Nekhau, who reigned from 589 to 570 BC. This pharaoh died in a rebellion led by his general and son-in-law, Amos. Unfortunately, this pharaoh was actually called Aprias, Herodotus 2:169, and on his monuments as Ua-ab-Ra, or Wahibri. Perhaps the pharaoh used the name Hophrah when he sent letters to the Jews? The biblical author was using the literary device of a royal murder to put an instructive, quote, prophecy into the mouth of, quote, Jeremiah. His oracle of woe was directed at recalcitrant Jews, many of whom lived in Egypt and were susceptible to Egyptian religious practices. Third section. Imperial Israel. Supposedly, an Israelite empire flourished in the 10th century BC, during a time of temporary weakness of both Assyria and Egypt. Yet the fabled empire of David and Solomon remains just that, a fable, unsupported by any evidence, and empires normally leave a great deal of evidence. The so-called, quote, united monarchy is found only in the Bible. The, quote, empire has no monuments, no inscriptions, and no artifacts. Neither David nor Solomon is as much as mentioned in the huge corpus of state records of either Egypt or Assyria. Concedes a, in quotes, pro-Imperial Israel historian, quote, Solomon, in the eyes of Israelite historians, marked the apex of Israelite achievement. Curiously, no reference to him or his father David or their empire in a non-Israelite source is known. End quote. Isserlin, The Israelites, page 72. But of course, there is nothing curious about a non-existent empire stretching, quote, from the Euphrates to Egypt, leaving no evidence of its non-existence. Modern Israel is peppered with, quote-unquote, Solomon's monuments, but not one of them has any genuine claim to the appellation. Legendary kings David and Solomon supposedly had an imperial capital in Jerusalem. Yet extensive archaeology in the city reveals Jerusalem was a village in the 10th century BC. In contrast, Megiddo, quote, part of the empire, unquote, far to the north, had a palace. In reality, separate and distinctive chiefdoms developed in Samaria and Judah in the 9th century. They were never a quote-unquote united monarchy. The north, Samaria, was larger, richer, and more developed, and soon succumbed to the Assyrians. Judah, in the south, in reaction, produced its pious biblical fraud, castigating the apostate kings of the 8th and 9th century northern kingdom of, quote, Israel, and elevating its own importance in an earlier, fantasized empire ruled from an imperial capital of Jerusalem. David, the boy wonder. Quote, the biblical story of David is indeed mythic in nature. He spent most of his career as a brigand king, and where he ruled, he did so by employing murder and mayhem. End quote. Baruch Halpem, David's Secret Demons, pages 479 and 480. David, quote, son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, end quote, is a, in quotes, curiously elusive figure, Oxford Companion to the Bible. Interns, shepherd, giant killer, court musician, poet, warlord, and king, nothing and no one outside the Bible notes his existence. In the most famous Davidic yarn, the young hero brought down a 9-foot giant with a slingshot, causing the entire Philistine army to run off. 1 Samuel 17. Not only is the tale highly implausible, but in the original uncorrected version of the story, 2 Samuel 21:19, it was Elhanan who killed Goliath. In an equally dubious tradition, the biblical Psalms are ascribed to the Phantom King, but in truth the Psalms were still being written as late as the 2nd century BC. In another delightfully tasteless episode, David secures his elevation to the royal house with a gift of foreskins. Quote, "Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men, and David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife." End quote. 1 Samuel 18:27. Thus David has all the indications of a hero myth, complete with mighty deeds and multiple borrowed elements. In 1993, a 13-line Aramaic inscription came to light from Tel Dan in northern Israel, recording that an Aramean king killed, quote, Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. I sent their towns to ruin, their land to desolation. End quote. The fragmented inscription was dated to the 9th century. If genuine, and there are serious doubts about that, the inscription appears to confirm that a chieftain called David may not be pure invention. Yet even then, the inscription contradicts the biblical story that it was Jehu who assassinated the tribal leaders in Jezreel. Quote, "And Jehu drew a bow with his full strength, and smote Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. But when Ahaziah, the king of Judah, saw this, he fled by the way of the garden house. And Jehu followed after him, and said, Smite him also in the chariot." End quote. 2 Kings 9:24 through 27. If an original, quote, Dawid inspired the legendary king, he was an inconsequential bandit chieftain in the Judean hills, nothing more. Outside of the biblical text, there is no historical proof of a Hebrew king ruling a, quote, empire, whether named David or anything else. Possibly the only element of truth in the whole biblical saga is the episode of David as renegade and outlaw leader living from theft. And perhaps it was none other than Hazael, a 9th century king of Aram Damascus, who really did have a, quote, empire, who inspired the Davidic legend. Based on the kings of Damascus? Quote, Damascus reached its zenith during the reign of Hazael. Transjordanian regions were overrun. Hazael was able to cross Israelite territory to progress down the coastal plain to take Gath in Philistia. In fact, Hazael appears to have established an empire or sphere of influence not unlike that ascribed to David. End quote. B.S.J. Isserlin, The Israelites, page 86. The city of Hazael, Damascus, is at least 4,000 years old. It is recorded as being conquered by Pharaoh Thutmose in the 15th century BC, and it became the capital of an Aramean kingdom from the 11th century BC. The kingdom of Aram Damascus resisted the Assyrians until late in the 9th century BC, and even came up against Pharaoh Shoshenq in the Jezreel Valley, conquering Israelite Dan along the way. Israelite refugees, displaced by the Arameans, resettled in the hill country. Quote, around 835 and 800 BC, the kingdom of Aram Damascus controlled the upper Jordan Valley and significant areas in northeastern Israel, and devastated major Israelite administrative centers in the fertile Jezreel Valley as well. End quote. Finkelstein Silberman, page 202. Dan, Hazor, Jezreel, and Megiddo were among the cities destroyed by the Arameans. King Hazael enjoyed a 40-year reign. 844 to 803 BC, just like that attributed to the biblical David. But in contrast to the fanciful heroics and court intrigue recorded of the Jewish king, the Bible has nothing to say of Hazael's very real 9th century conquest of much of Israel. Archaeology says otherwise. For example, scholars of Bar Ilan University have recently established that the conqueror of the city of Methagama, Tel Es Safi / Goth, was not David as alleged by 2 Samuel 8:1, but none other than Hazael of Damascus. Edom and Nabatea. Arab kingdoms in the south may also have played a role in the creation of the Davidic legend. Unlike the fabled kingdom of the quote-unquote united monarchy, evidence of the Edomite Nabatean kingdoms is not in doubt. The Edomites, who were settled between the Dead and Red Seas, pioneered copper working in the region and had established trade routes to the north. According to the biblical narrative, the long-suffering Edomites were often at the receiving end of Israelite aggression. Quote, "Every male in Edom had been smitten," end quote. 1 Kings 11:15. The Bible says little that is useful, other than to recount the bizarre story that the Edomites had sheltered David from Saul during his struggle for power, and then shortly afterwards had been massacred by him. The likelihood is that bands of Israelites from the hill country, David among them, raided Edomite caravans, hence the mutual hostility. Over time, the Edomites had migrated into southern Palestine, where Edomia became Idumea. From the 6th century onward, a new tribe, the Nabateans, moved into the region vacated by the Edomites and, by their control from Petra of the lucrative trade routes going north to Damascus and west to Gaza, they bypassed the Israelite enclaves. The Nabateans established their own, quote, empire, which lasted into the 2nd century AD. But Idumea itself was conquered and Judaized during the time of the, quote, Maccabee, John Hyrcanus. Empire of Dreams. The fable of King David's, quote, empire building actually gets scant coverage in the Bible, and what it does record is far from convincing. In the biblical narrative, almost the sole strategy of the Israelite war bands is, quote, surprise. Though inferior in numbers and weaponry, with, quote-unquote, surprise attacks, they repeatedly panic vast armies into disorderly rout. The brevity and brutality with which the Holy Book records the Civil War, the capture of Jerusalem, and the conquest of the whole of Syrio-Palestine is breathtaking. Episode 1. Civil War. Having killed a giant and married into the royal family with a gift of foreskins, David falls foul of his father-in-law Saul and becomes a mercenary for the hated Philistines. They give him the town of Ziklag, from where he massacres Amalekite nomads of Sinai. But when Saul and company get trashed by Philistines at Mount Gilboa, Saul's son Ishbaal, inauspicious name that, is proclaimed king somewhere east of the river Jordan. David, now resident at Hebron, is also proclaimed king. Hostile coexistence, laced with a variety of arbitrary murders, ensues for over 2 years, at which point the assassination of Ishbaal leaves the field free for David to rule, quote-unquote, all Israel, most of which, of course, is still in the hands of the Philistines. Episode 2. The Capture of Jerusalem. Our hero decides he needs a new residence in the hills, the town of Jebus. Oddly enough, this Jebusite Canaanite, Philistine enclave in the heart of, quote, Hebrew territory, had never succumbed to Israelite conquest. Yet David has no problem taking the, quote, citadel. How couldn't he, with the Lord behind his every move? The blind and lame get short shrift from our conquering hero. Quote, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, which spake unto David, saying, Thou shalt not come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. And David said, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, The blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So David dwelt in the fort, and called it the city of David. End quote. 1 Samuel 5, 6-9. Episode 3. Conquering everywhere else, just like that. Defeat of the Philistines. Quote, and after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Methagama out of the hand of the Philistines. End quote. 2 Samuel 8:1. Conquest of the north. Quote, David smote also Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. David slew of the Syrians 22,000 men. David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David. End quote. 2 Samuel 8:3-6. Genocide and conquest of the south. Quote, for it came to pass when David was in Edom, and Joab, the captain of the host, was gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male in Edom. End quote. 1 Kings 11:15. Mass slaughter in the Transjordan. Quote, and he smote Moab, and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground. Even with 2 lines measured he to put to death, and with 1 full line to keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. End quote. 2 Samuel 8:2. Quote, and it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabbah. End quote. 2 Samuel 11:1. Not exactly Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars. As archaeology unequivocally testified, in the 10th century BC, in the valleys of Palestine, Canaanite culture continued uninterrupted. Thankfully, most of the biblical carnage that is the motif of, in quotes, David's empire building is a fanatic's fantasy. Solomon, emperor with no clothes. Quote, but he has nothing on, end quote. A little child cried out at last. Anderson, The Emperor's New Clothes. Solomon didn't need to conquer anything. The empire was his inheritance from his father David. Solomon merely ruled in magnificence, effortlessly receiving and spending an imperial fortune, collecting girlfriends, and dispensing wisdom. Really odd that no one seemed to have noticed. The fabled, in quotes, golden age of Solomon is an era and an empire for which there is not the slightest trace of evidence. Could it all be a pious fraud? Solomon the builder? 1 Kings would have us believe that Solomon used, in quotes each, costly stone, the best timber, and a vast army of conscript and slave labor to build showplace Jerusalem, notably a lavish temple, a magnificent palace for himself, another magnificent palace for his Egyptian queen, a mighty military headquarters, the quote-unquote House of the Forest of Lebanon, an auditorium, Hall of Pillars, a law court, Hall of Judgment. In addition, we are told Solomon built fortress cities at Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, quote-unquote store cities elsewhere, and the port of Ezion-Geber. Strange how not a single stone of this vast catalog of construction has been unequivocally identified and agreed by archaeologists. Lavish temple? Quote, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord, and the whole house he overlaid with gold. And within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high, and he overlaid the cherubims with gold. And he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers. End quote. 1 Kings 6. Quote-unquote artists' impressions of that fabulous temple are commonplace, all based upon the biblical fantasy. We are told the temple was 7 years in construction. Biblical descriptions of the building and its furniture are precise and vivid, as in 1 Kings 6. But then they would be. They were a wish list of 7th and 6th century BC priests. Believe it or not, the 2 pillars had names, Jachin and Boaz. Quote, the archaeological evidence in Jerusalem for the famous building projects of Solomon is non-existent. 19th and 20th century excavations around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem failed to identify even a trace of Solomon's fabled temple or palace complex. End quote. Finkelstein, Silberman, page 128. Royal quote-unquote chariot city of Megiddo. In the 1950s, Yagael Yadin, Israeli Defense Chief of Staff turned archaeologist, decided that the ruins of Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer were the legendary, quote, fortress cities of Solomon. Quote, our great guide was the Bible, end quote, he said. Thus, he confirmed the Bible with the Bible. This was despite an absence of any find at the sites naming Solomon, but a cartouche naming Pharaoh Amenhotep III instead. Destruction of the sites was attributed to, quote, Yahweh's instrument, unquote, the 8th century Assyrians. But the Aramaeans beat them to it, before themselves succumbing to the Assyrians in 811 BC. Jeroboam II, 788 to 747 BC, an Assyrian client king of Israel, rebuilt Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor, and presided over the last period of Israel's prosperity. His reign helped to color the legend of, quote, Solomon, written in the 7th century. The so-called, quotes, Solomon's Gates are wishful thinking, belonging to the 9th, not 10th, century BC. In quotes, Solomon's stables, but for the fact they're not Solomon's and not stables. Distinctive storerooms were so identified until a palace structure beneath them came to light. Then the, quote, stables were reattributed to Ahab, so that the palace could be identified as, quote, Solomon's. In truth, the palaces date from the 9th, not 10th century BC, and the city of the stables is even later, the 8th century BC. But were they stables? Nothing relating to horses, cavalry, or chariots has ever come to light. Quotes, horse troughs had drainage holes and were possibly vats for preparing opium, a narcotic for the pain of childbirth and disease. Solomon is said to have had, quote, 1,400, unquote, chariots. 1 Kings 126, a prodigious army by ancient standards. Yet only 5 years after the fabled king's death, the same Bible says Pharaoh Shishak successfully invaded Judah and captured its fortified cities with little or no military resistance. 2 Chronicles 12. Solomon's wisdom, in quotes, smarter than all. Quote, and Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, and his fame was in all nations round about. End quote. 1 Kings 4:30 and 31. In parallel to the biblical tradition which ascribes the Psalms to David, the Proverbs are attributed to Solomon. A monarch, we are assured of towering wisdom. But the attribution is entirely gratuitous. The heroic themes of Israelite history, deliverance from Egypt, the wanderings, the conquest of Canaan, the establishment of the monarchy itself, are never so much as mentioned in Proverbs, and for a very simple reason. They are a distillation of essentially, quote, foreign wisdom, notably Egyptian and Canaanite. Quote, every part of the book bears the mark of foreign influences. The close connection between the first part of the 30 sayings with Egyptian wisdom is only a special instance. End quote. J.C. Rylarsdam, Peake's Commentary, page 444. Some proverbs were composed as late as the 3rd century BC, a tad late for Solomonic authorship, and one might reasonably ask, if Solomon was so wise, how could he land up worshipping the wrong gods? Solomon, son-in-law to an unnamed pharaoh? In keeping with the superlative qualities required of a national hero, Solomon, we are told, was prodigiously virile. In his harem were 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:1. It seems that one of his playmates was a princess from Egypt, and her father, assuredly one of the most powerful men in the world at the time, led an expedition into Palestine in order to make a wedding gift of a ruined city full of corpses. Quote, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt himself, had come up and then captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and the Canaanites dwelling in the city he had killed. So he gave it as a parting gift to his daughter, the wife of Solomon. End quote. 1 Kings 9:16. An important dynastic marriage, and yet the pharaoh goes unnamed. Of course, the episode and the marriage are totally unknown in the Egyptian record. Similarly, when an enemy of Solomon, in quotes, Hadad the Edomite, flees to the Egyptian court and receives from a friendly pharaoh house, bread, land, and marriage into the royal household, it is only the inconsequential pharaonic wife, Tahpenes, who is named. 1 Kings 11:19 and 20. Could it all be a fabulous yarn, perhaps? Without a trace. Though much honored in legend and Hollywood, The simple truth is that no evidence has ever been found of David, Solomon, or his, quote, empire. Neither secular history nor archaeology provides a shred of confirmation for the highly detailed and colorful biblical stories. Not a single stone or artifact from what was supposedly the world's most fabulous temple has ever been identified. The extraordinary magnificence of the Jewish empire is matched only by the total void when we seek confirmation from any other source. The Asiatic Greek Herodotus, writing one of the world's first histories in the 5th century BC, wrote of peoples and places throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. Herodotus knew of lake dwellers in faraway Europe and of barbarous tribes along the North African coast. He was familiar with the painted warriors of the Sudan and with the nomads of southern Russia. Yet in all his work, Herodotus makes no single mention of Jews or Hebrews, Judah or Israel. He speaks of the coastal cities of Sidon and Tyre, but never of Jerusalem. He records the great temple of Aphrodite Urania at Ascalon, but fails to mention any temple of Solomon. He does, however, know of circumcision, and says this, quote, "The Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only races which from ancient times have practiced circumcision. The Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine themselves admit that they adopted the practice from Egypt. No other nations use circumcision, and all of these are without doubt following the Egyptian lead." Herodotus, The Histories, Book 2, page 104. Penguin, page 167. Herodotus gathered much of his information firsthand from priests and holy men. His travels took him to the frontier of Upper Egypt and to Babylon itself. He also recorded popular beliefs and legends. Speaking of the inhabitants at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, he says, quote, "The Phoenicians, with the Syrians of Palestine, have a tradition that in the ancient times they lived on the Persian Gulf, but migrated to the Syrian coast where they are found today. This part of Syria, together with the country which extends southward to Egypt, is all known as Palestine." End quote. Ibid, page 472. For Herodotus, this land is the home of, quote, "Syrians known as Palestinians," end quote. If tribesmen in the interior escaped his attention, they assuredly were not the authors of a great empire which supposedly had existed a few hundred years before his own time. More than 2,000 years later, nothing has emerged to change our understanding. Quote, "This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. Perhaps even harder to swallow is that the united monarchy of David and Solomon, which is described by the Bible as a regional power, was at most a small tribal kingdom." End quote. Herat's Magazine, October 1999. All that we do have is some evidence of minor regional warlords or, quote, "city bosses" or kings, who, in the centuries before first Assyria and then Babylon, overran Palestine. Yet more tellingly, in the Jewish, quote, "nationalistic saga," we have the rationale for a theocratic state and a religious caste system. The priests are born to rule, both because it is Yahweh's design and because secular kings, even magnificent ones, transgress and run amok. Yet kings are not excluded out of hand. The priesthood loathed the diminution of their power and the intrusion of secular laws, but were delighted by the enlargement of the territory of the theocratic state, such as might be achieved by a warrior king. and as idealized in the, quote, empire conjectured for Solomon. The duality of power, the conflict between king and priest, runs as a theme through subsequent Jewish history and was never resolved. Above all, from the, quote, Davidic legend, we get the supposed primacy of the, quote, house of David, and the awful conviction that when the hour is right, a warrior/priest, or a warrior and a priest, keeping him on the straight and narrow, will appear to lead the nation of Israel against the forces of darkness, a Messiah or Messiahs. Fourth section. Jews on the margins of empire, Assyria and Babylon. The major players of the ancient Middle East, century after century, arose in the fertile river valleys and floodplains primarily of Egypt and Mesopotamia. First one region, then another, produced a dominant city-based culture which had the wealth and resources to conquer an empire. During the Old Testament period, whatever might have been happening on a few hilltops in Judea, on the wider canvas, Assyria, based on the cities of Assur and Nineveh, was conquering an empire. At its height, this included both Egypt and the whole of Mesopotamia. The corridor through Palestine, aside from the coastal strip, was too harsh and inhospitable to engender a similar development. Hilly and remote from trade routes, with few settlements and a backward nomadic population, the land was loosely organized into minor, quote, kinglets of rival clans, where, rather like the Celts at a similar stage of nation building, magistrates took on powers of governance. This is the period that the Jewish sacred history calls, quote, judges. In the mythology, it is Judge Samuel who appoints, or anoints, both the first and second, quote-unquote, kings of Israel, Saul and David. Assyria. In the fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, around the year 1813 BC, Shamshi-Adad united the cities of Assur, Nineveh, Arbel, and Nimrud into a cohesive unit, Assyria. It was one of the world's first, quote, superpowers. Several Assyrian empires rose and fell over the following 1,200 years. The last period of imperial conquest began with Shalmaneser III in the 9th century BC. Assyria's main rival, of course, was Egypt. 5 warrior/kings in particular built the Assyrian Empire. Shalmaneser III, 859 to 824, Tiglath-Pileser III, 743 to 726, Sargon II, 721 to 705, Esarhaddon, 680 to 669, and Assurbanipal, 668 to 627. The secret of their success appears to have been threefold: ironworking, the war chariot, and an efficient civil service collecting taxation. 500 miles to the south of Assyria, pastoral nomads indigenous to the region periodically settled the Canaanite highlands. Settlement was a response to grain shortage induced by periodic disruption of lowland agriculture. Drought forced the marginal farmers back to nomadism again. The first settlement period was in the early Bronze Age from 3500 BC. The second in the Middle Bronze Age from 2000 BC. The third, and most significant, period of settlement from 1200 BC was a response to the collapse of Canaanite cities in the face of invasion by the Sea Peoples. These fringe pastoralists/sustenance farmers became the original, quote, Israelites, most settling in the central highlands of Samaria, rather fewer further south in Judah. In Samaria, a centralized monarchy on the Assyrian model was established during the course of the 9th century. The first Jewish monarchs that secular history records anything at all about are the kings Omri and his son Ahab, who succeeded in halting the Assyrian advance for a few years. As a, quote, idolatrous minor king, Omri's successes go unnoted in the sacred texts, but the murderous end of the dynasty is celebrated in 2 Kings. In the clash of the Assyrian Empire to the northeast with the Egyptian Empire to the southwest, the Israelites were at best mercenaries and conscripts. For much of the 8th century, the tiny kingdoms of Israel and Judah were in vassalage to the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, which for a time held the Assyrians at bay. The shadow of Shalmaneser, fall of the northern kingdom. As Assyrian monuments proudly recall, from the mighty city of Nimrud on the Tigris, King Shalmaneser III invaded lands to the west. In 854 BC, at the hilltop city of Karkur in Syria, Shalmaneser defeated an alliance of petty Levantine kingdoms attempting to block his advance. His defeated opponents were the kingdoms of Damascus, Hamath, and, in quotes, Ahab the Israelite. Quote, I razed, destroyed, and burned 2,000 chariots and 10,000 troops of Ahab the Israelite. End quote. Shalmaneser III. These words from the Kirk Stele celebrating the Assyrian victory are the first attestation of an Israelite warlord in the historical record. The Assyrians continued their advance in the next campaign season, this time defeating, quote, Jehu, son of Omri, an event commemorated on the so-called Black Obelisk. The later biblical story of 2 Kings 9:10 will have it that Jehu was not Omri's son, but an anointed assassin who in fact murdered the, quote, house of Omri on orders from Elisha. Thus, Shalmaneser's artifacts confirm the existence of a small Israelite kingdom in the mid-9th century. Syria/Palestine was conquered in 841 BC, and King Jehu of Israel was one of the petty kings forced to pay tribute. The Aramean kingdom of Damascus under King Hazael continued a protracted resistance. Another stele, erected for Shalmaneser by his son, records that beams of Lebanese cedar had been used in temple construction, an idea that resurfaced in the legend of Judaism's imperial hero. Quote, I ascended the Lebanon mountains and cut down the mighty beams of cedar. At that time I carried those cedars from Lebanon, and at the gate of the temple of Sholmanu, my lord, I laid them down. End quote. Stele of Shamshi Adad V, 824 to 811 BC. The intrusion of Shalmaneser is unmentioned in the biblical texts, but perhaps he is not entirely forgotten. Shalmaneser was named for the god Shalmanu Ashared, or Shalmanu is foremost. Shalmanu is the Assyrian equivalent of Suleiman in Arabic, which in English gives us Solomon. Shalmaneser was a genuine Semitic imperialist who really did rule from, in quotes, sea to sea. In any event, the subsequent fall of the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital Samaria in 722 BC to Sargon II, though erroneously credited to Shalmaneser, is recorded in 2 Kings 17:6. Supposedly at this time, quote, 10 tribes of the Jewish race, end quote, were lost through conquest. Quote, Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only." End quote. 2 Kings 17:18. Assyrian colonists were resettled on the Sumerian lands denuded of people. A triumphant Sargon returned to the Assyrian heartland and built himself a new capital of Khorsabad, or Dur-Sharukan. The traumatic loss of most of the Israelite, quote, nation was to be the catalyst for a profound religious revolution. Yahweh priests fleeing south to the tiny enclave of Judah stiffened Jewish resistance by dreaming up the notion of a former, in quotes, great empire, which, under priestly direction, would rise again. The Omride Kingdom of Israel. We can thus be confident that an Israelite, quote, empire did eventually emerge, but in Samaria, not Judah, and in the 9th, not the 10th century BC. Its founder was Omri, not David, a soldier/king who built himself the impressive palace city of Samaria on the Syrian model. His dynasty, son Ahab, grandsons Ahaziah and Jeroham, raised a powerful army, built the cities of Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor, and ruled a successful state, albeit defeated by Shalmaneser in 854 BC, and Hazael of Aram Damascus in 842 BC. But the Omrides were not biblical heroes in the mold of David and Solomon. On the contrary, they are vilified and despised for that gravest of sins, worshiping the wrong God. In particular, Ahab and his wife Jezebel attract the worst opprobrium, mouthed in the curses of the wandering, quote, prophets Elijah and Elisha. Jezebel is thrown from a window and dogs eat her corpse. The isolated, poorer, smaller, and more backward Israelite chiefdom of Judah, envious of and hostile towards its northern neighbor, would eventually use the fate of Samaria, or Israel, for theological purposes. Look what happens when you disobey Yahweh. Samaria succumbed to territorial erosion, first to Aram Damascus and then to Assyria. The capital city of Samaria finally fell in 720 BC. Fanatics of the Yahweh cult began the process of inventing Judaism and writing a sacred history. In the fantasy, the village of Jerusalem became an imperial city. The, in quotes, house of David became an imperial dynasty. Meanwhile, in the Judean mountains, in 701 BC, the Assyrians returned under their king Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BC. Judah, the minor, quote, southern kingdom, allied with Egypt and Phoenicia, was devastated. The Assyrians occupied the province and besieged the Jewish king Hezekiah, 715 to 687 BC, in Jerusalem, quote, like a bird in a cage, end quote. But plague compelled the Assyrians to move on, and Judah, reduced to little more than the environs of Jerusalem, maintained a precarious existence for another century by costly tributes to the Assyrian king. Putting a brave face on events, Hezekiah's priests heralded the reprieve of Jerusalem as a victory for Yahweh. Isaiah would have us believe that overnight the, quote, angel of the Lord, unquote, smote the Assyrians, leaving 185,000 to, quote, arise early in the morning, and behold, they were all dead corpses, end quote. Isaiah 37:36. To give a comparison to this ludicrous assertion, Hadrian's legions wiped Judea off the map early in the 2nd century AD with about 40,000 troops. Over the next half-century, quote, Judaism emerged, a religious response to the Assyrian assault and the total loss of the northern kingdom. Josiah's Reformation. Hezekiah was followed by his son Manasseh, 686 to 642 BC, and grandson Amon, 641 to 640, both castigated in the sacred texts for ignoring priestly dictates. But then a hero of Judaism emerged, the 8-year-old Josiah. During his, quote, guided reign, 639 to 609 BC, quote, reform elevated the priests of the Yahweh cult and eliminated the competition. Sacred, quote, high places in the countryside were destroyed and rival priests were murdered. Communion with God now became a monopoly of the Jerusalem Yahwehists. Conveniently, a second statement of, in quotes, the law of Moses, Deuteronomy, was, quote, found in the temple to give the divine seal of approval. To graphically illustrate what was possible in a dynastic theocracy, the fable of the, in quotes, Yahweh-guided fabulous kingdom of Saul, David, and Solomon, set 300 years earlier, was now sketched out in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. The pious fantasy would be further embellished in the 6th and 5th centuries in the aftermath of Babylonian conquest of Judah and the, quote, captivity, 597 to 539 BC. The fable of, in quotes, Imperial Israel, long on court intrigue and adulteries, but short on how the empire was won, reflects incidental detail from the empires the Israelites themselves faced as an enemy, the Assyrians and Babylonians of the 9th through 6th centuries. Sennacherib's Nineveh. Sennacherib, the conqueror of Judah, moved the Assyrian capital to Nineveh, a vast walled city of 1,800 acres, some 50 times the size of Jerusalem. Fitments to the royal palace included 3 kilometers of carvings over 100 massive bulls and sphinxes and vast quantities of Lebanese cedar carried over 500 miles and decorated with gold and silver. Echoes of these costly fitments would find their way into Judaism's fantasy. Quote, the throne had 6 steps, and 2 lions stood beside the stays. And 12 lions stood there on one side and on the other upon the 6 steps. And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon. End quote. 1 Kings 10. Assyrian inscriptions list the king's wars, booty, and buildings, just like the Book of Kings. Egypt's last bid for empire. Pharaoh Necho II. The other superpower of the ancient Middle East was Egypt. But in the 7th century BC, it too succumbed to Assyrian invasion and conquest, 664, by Assurbanipal. It seems that the Assyrian conquerors of Egypt installed a vassal called Necho, circa 655, as, quote, governor in the Delta. His grandson was the future pharaoh Necho II. Herodotus records that Necho succeeded his father Psamtik I in 610 BC as pharaoh and assigns him a reign of 16 years. Monuments and artifacts attest to his existence. Necho seems to have been an enterprising king. Herodotus writes that he attempted to complete the canal connecting the Red Sea with the Nile, and when he abandoned that project, he sent a Phoenician expedition to circumnavigate Africa, which was successfully accomplished in 3 years. In real history, Pharaoh Necho II saw an opportunity to revive an Egyptian empire in Syria by assisting his Assyrian ally in difficulties following the fall of Nineveh to the Babylonians in 612 BC. Interestingly enough, the Bible tells its own story of Necho, or Necho, in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. In the biblical fantasy, for no very good reason, Josiah, king of Judah, gets in the way of Necho's army moving north. The odd behavior of the Judean king includes, quote, disguise and choosing an unfavorable battleground. But it is Necho, the Egyptian polytheist, who is on, quote, God's business, and Josiah is being foolish. The point, of course, is theological. Don't you dare go against the Lord. Quote, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Karshemish by Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho from the mouth of God, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. 2 Chronicles 35:20-22. In this silly story, the Egyptian king has become the mouthpiece of the Hebrew, quote, God, who has sent him on a mission. Quote, but he sent ambassadors to him, saying, what have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I come not against thee this day, but against the house wherewith I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. End quote. 2 Chronicles 35:21. Archaeologists, aware that Josiah, who was in no position to challenge the mighty Egyptian army, suspect that Pharaoh Necho merely summoned Josiah to some sort of royal parley and had him killed for unknown reasons. With the mostly righteous Josiah dead in 609, Necho continued north but was himself defeated at Karshemish, 605. Judah slid into oblivion, the Assyrian Empire collapsed, and the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar became the new masters. As to Necho giving, quote, Josiah a knockout blow on his way to the Euphrates, Herodotus says nothing. But then, Herodotus had never heard of the Jews anyway. Babylon. On his return from the northern front, according to the Bible, Necho installed a puppet king, Jehoiakim, in Jerusalem, but poor Jehoiakim also, quote, does evil in the sight of the Lord, end quote, and gets his own divine comeuppance, this time from Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, 601 BC. Judah is conquered in 586 and its people carried into exile. In the biblical story, Babylon's governor is murdered, and fearing retribution, Jews, that is, the ones who didn't get carried into exile, flee to Egypt. This includes, quote, Jeremiah, a phantom 7th century prophet created by the 3rd and 4th century BC scribe who wrote the entire Josiah saga, 2 Chronicles and Jeremiah. At this stage, the Jews are under Persian rule. Egypt is weak but nominally independent. The Jewish priestly scribe hammers home his point about, quote, bad kings indulging in, quotes, foreign practices, reiterating the central message of Deuteronomy, the, quote, fifth book of Moses, supposedly found during Josiah's rebuilding of the temple. It looks forward to happier times when pious kings are controlled by priests and, in quotes, fear God. Quote, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God. End quote. Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. Babylon nurtures the Jewish priesthood. Following the successes at Nineveh and Carchemish, the new imperial power Babylon moved swiftly into Palestine. Its conquests included the tiny kingdom of Judah. There was no convenient plague this time. The tribal leadership was forced into exile and resettled in Babylon under the eye of its Babylonian conqueror. Forced migrations of this type were not untypical of the period. Removal of the social elite effectively inhibited organized resistance in a new colony. But unlike earlier displacements, the Hebrews were resettled as a single group and remained free to meet, trade, and own land. Quote, the exiles were settled in some of the most attractive and important districts in and around Babylon. End quote. Karen Armstrong, A History of Jerusalem, page 80. Though the so-called, quote, exile lasted barely half a century, from the capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC to the rise of a new dynasty in 539 BC, during this period the Jews borrowed extensively from their hosts. The Jews had much to learn from the rich cosmopolitan culture of Mesopotamia. Here they witnessed trade, commerce, and religion on an imperial scale. In Babylon, the great walled, in quotes, city of wisdom, there were numerous gods and no fewer than 55 temples. Here was to be found a vast literature of religious texts. In particular, the great epic of creation, the story of Gilgamesh. Here, too, were legends of the origin of kingship and moralistic fables. Notably, certain priests, parentheses, so-called prophets, wrote texts which explained the tribal misfortune of the Jews in terms of neglect of a particular deity and of the desirability of priestly rule. The book of Elijah, literally, God is Jehovah, is a story set 3 centuries earlier. In this tale, the prophet denounces King Ahab and his wife Jezebel for that most dastardly of crimes, having a barbecue for the wrong god. Just in case indignant words are not enough, the hero personally slays several hundred rival priests of Baal. But if fidelity to the correct God is the only way of keeping your skin, why does the, quote, righteous man suffer? The Babylonians had a poem which addressed the very issue from at least 2000 BC. A righteous man, Tabu Utel Bel, suffered unjustly at the hands of the gods and was stricken by a terrible disease. The reflective story is rehashed by the exiled Jews as the Book of Job. Of particular significance, in view of the subsequent appearance of the Book of Genesis, were Babylonian stories of a great flood, complete with a hero, an ark, and animals, an Assyrian tale of a, quote, Tower of Babel, the early life of King Sargon of Samaria, who was an infant, was floated down the Tigris in a reed boat and subsequently brought up by a princess, and a tale of the giving of the law to King Hammurabi of Babylon by the sun god Shamash. 3,654 lines of text inscribed on an 8-foot-high block of black diorite. Wonder of wonders, on this ancient tablet of stone, carved 600 years before, quote, Moses, are, quote, some 50 articles of the so-called Mosaic laws, the identity of which is practically verbatim, end quote. Bratton, page 37. In Babylon, the Jews learned of prayer, dream interpretation, astrology, almanacs, and omens. For the first time, they encountered the notion of a personal immortality and the fantasy of, quote, resurrecting the dead. Impressed by the high culture of their hosts, the Jews adopted the lunar calendar of the Babylonians and, like them, began their year in the spring. In the Babylonian setting, the Jews met in, quote, gatherings, synagogues in Greek, for the first time. Leadership of those assemblies assumed a, quote, priestly character. One such leader, Ezekiel, kept the clan together by stressing the role in the community of this Yahweh priesthood and how the, quote, glory of their God, even without an ark or temple, was there with them in Babylon. Thus, Yahweh floated free of confinement to, in quotes, sacred space. The chief god of Babylon was called Marduk, not Yahweh, but for Jews from the bleak land of Judea, the experience of his worship was a revelation. As emigres whose uniqueness would only be preserved by a dogged devotion to a particular deity, reinforced by some self-imposed dietary laws and circumcision, they would have been particularly impressed by the lifestyle enjoyed by the professional temple priesthood. In Babylon, full-time priests monopolized interaction with the supernatural and, in consequence, enjoyed immense wealth, prestige, and power. In contrast, in pagan Rome, priests were part-time, co-opted to the honorary role, and had other civic or military duties. Cyrus and the Temple City, theocracy established. Quote, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, end quote. Exodus 19:6. Dynastic weakness within the empire of Medes, the northern ally of the Babylonians, brought the Persian king Cyrus I to power. Cyrus, 559 to 529, became master of an enlarged Media, to which he added the Babylonian Empire itself in 539. As a self-styled, quote, great king, Cyrus was anxious to have all gods on his side for further conquests. He was thus moved to present an undreamed-of opportunity to the pious elders of the Jews, a Yahweh cult in the satrap of Judea. Accordingly, many of the Jews, mostly descendants of the original exiles, were returned to the old homeland. A figure of 42,360, quote, together with their servants and 200 singers, is quoted in the book of Ezra, 264 and 65. Several times the reported number taken into exile. Cyrus, the fire-worshipping heathen king, became the hero of the Jewish priests. Apparently he had Yahweh's endorsement. Quote, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. End quote. Isaiah 45:1. Descendants of the original exiles, now Persianized, were sent back under Prince Sheshbazzar to set up a temple to help the Persian war effort. The temple's design, a succession of courtyards set high on a hill, at its heart enclosing a, in quotes, holy of holies, was inspired by the multi-level temple ziggurats, which, in quotes, reached up to heaven, that the Jews had seen in Mesopotamia. Under the patronage of Cyrus, and despite the local opposition of Jews who had never left, the, in quotes, children of Judah established a theocratic colony on the Persian model under an appointed Persian governor. Persian rule of Judah would last 2 centuries. Monotheism. Before the exile, Jewish religion, such as it was, had man facing an anthropomorphic, capricious tribal god, who looked for obedience rather than worship to assuage his anger. It was, apparently, Abraham's unswerving obedience when asked by Yahweh to sacrifice his son that validated his choice as, quote, patriarch. But at least obedience was within the wit of man himself. Pre-Babylon, only the, quote, tribe of Levi could be priests, and they had performed the role of itinerant shamans. Post-Babylon, the Levite priests were downgraded to menial temple workers, and the Sadducee clan took over the high priesthood. By abrogating to themselves the when and how of placating/honoring the gods, the earthly power of the priesthood was assured. The theology changed to reflect the new organization. Yahweh was elevated to sole God and was deemed to require endless sacrifice to placate his wrath. Thus all Jews acquired a duty to bring offerings to the priests, who were thereby freed of more mundane tasks. Not only did this give the priesthood their daily provisions and a major slice of the butchery business, but also control over the lucrative leather trades. In time, tribute to the priesthood was extended to include tithes, dispensation fees, and commission on money changing. Only the, quote, clean shekel could be offered at the temple. No other coinage was acceptable. Taking their cue from Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of Persia, the returnees brought with them not only priestly monopoly and control over worship, and in a theocracy that implied control over law and social behavior as well, but also the notion of an evil god, Satan, as a counterpoise to the good God, Yahweh. Similarly, for the first time, Judaism acquired angels and demons. At this point appears the curious tale of an idyllic garden, shades of Babylon, a satanic snake, and a disobedient female, which nicely explained why life was full of wickedness, why women should be subjugated, and why there was death itself. The Persians made no images of their dual gods, but for them fire represented purity and was incarnation of the light god Mazda. On the other hand, matter, including the human body, was created by the dark god Angra Mainyu. In stark contrast, therefore, to the earlier influence of fertility rites of the Canaanite and Phoenician cities, the celebration of life, the Yahweh cult now became at heart hostile to the body. Human sexuality was to cause the priests more distress than any amount of bloodshed. And bloodshed there was, as the colonizers, the Golan, drove out and de-Judaized the original inhabitants of Judah, the Am Haaretz, or people of the land, whom they were forbidden to marry. With a brutal ruthlessness, for example, Ezra commanded Jews to, quote, send away their foreign wives and children. Quote, membership of Israel was now confined to the descendants of those who had been exiled in Babylon. End quote. Armstrong, page 102. The arrival of an organized priesthood acted as a brake on secular development, which might otherwise have produced a local monarch, albeit one under Persian dominance. Both Nehemiah, quote, cupbearer to the Persian king, and Ezra, his, quote-unquote, minister of Jewish affairs, introduced interpretations and refinements of, quote, the law, which kept the Jewish piety compatible with the interests and security of the empire. A sacred history invented. While fulsome in their praise of the Persian High King Cyrus, the priest authors of official texts made clear their misgivings about, quote, kings. The ambivalence is finely drawn in the tale set several hundred years earlier of an ideal kingship, in fact, of a golden age of kingship. The story had originally been composed during the reign of Josiah, in which two successive kings had each ruled for 40 years and had, in the main, exhibited all the right characteristics. True, they had had a few weaknesses, but these became manifest only when they went against Yahweh's laws, and of course the guidance of the priests. In this tale of Israel's Camelot, it seems kings, David and Solomon, his son, combine a brilliant mix of warrior vigilance with unfailing religious devotion. With Yahweh rooting for them, they slew, smote, and heroically annihilated peoples, including women and children, all the way from the Gulf of Aqaba to the river Euphrates. Ancient Israel was an empire, no less. David was chosen, i.e. anointed, for both himself and all subsequent generations by a priest, the judge Samuel. Once king, David returned the favor by, quote, anointing Zadok and all his descendants to the position of high priest. Thus, the Zadokite clan became the nucleus of the Sadducee priesthood, the authors of the whole fantastic story.